On the day after the Brazilian Grand Prix, recently inaugurated President Reagan left the Washington Hilton and a gunman fired all 6 shots from a revolver at him, wounding Reagan as well as Press Secretary James Brady, Washington police officer Thomas Delahanty, and Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy. The would-be assassin wanted to impress 18-year-old actress Jodie Foster, who he'd become obsessed with after seeing the film Taxi Driver, in which she was just 12. The bullet that hit Reagan broke a rib, punctured a lung and caused severe internal bleeding, and he remained in hospital for 2 weeks, though his political team were anxious that he be seen to still be in charge, and he was signing legislation the morning after his operation. Famously, when his wife Nancy arrived at the emergency department immediately after the shooting, he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck," and when asked later what was the first thing he'd do when he got home, he said he'd sit down. All the other victims recovered, but policeman Thomas Delahanty had permanent nerve damage to his left arm and was invalided out of the force, while press officer James Brady was left with slurred speech and as a wheelchair user for the rest of his life. After campaigning for handgun control for many years, Brady died in 2014. His death ruled a homicide as a result of his gunshot wound. Reagan, for his part, endorsed the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which finally became law in 1994. Incidentally, the movie podcast What Went Wrong just did a whole episode on Taxi Driver the movie, with an accompanying hour-long episode about the background to the Reagan assassination attempt and how it affected Jodie Foster as well as the more obvious victims. If that's something you want to know about, it's well worth an hour of your time. That was all supposed to have happened on the day of the 53rd Academy Awards, which was then postponed until the following evening, by which time Reagan was known to be out of danger. The big winner on the night was Robert Redford's directorial debut, Ordinary People, an adaptation of the family drama novel by Judith Guest. The film took the Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor for Timothy Hutton, and Best Adapted Screenplay for Alvin Sargent, with the major acting awards going to Robert De Niro for Raging Bull, Sissy Spacek for Coal Miner's Daughter, and Best Supporting Actress to Mary Steenburgen in Melvin and Howard, which also won the Best Original Screenplay Award for Bo Goldman. David Lynch's movie The Elephant Man had been a critical success and nominated in 8 categories, the most of any movie that year, but didn't win a single award, leading to an outcry among industry experts who particularly felt that its special makeup effects should be recognised, perhaps with an honorary award. For the 1982 Oscars, the Academy created a Best Makeup category. In Lebanon, a fragile ceasefire had been more or less holding in the complex multilateral civil war that had engulfed the country since 1975. The various Lebanese factions split into 2 very broad camps, the Christians, backed by Israel, and the Muslims, backed by Syria and the PLO. In 1978, a joint Arab deterrent force, including troops from Syria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, South Yemen and the UAE, had been formed under nominal Lebanese leadership, but divisions had quickly led to it becoming a more or less entirely Syrian organisation, and on the 1st of April 1981, its troops, with air support from the Syrian Air Force, launched an attack on the city of Zaleh, breaking the ceasefire and ushering in a new phase of the civil war. A by-election was held in the Westminster parliamentary constituency of Fermanagh and South Tyrone, in the southwest of Northern Ireland, following the death of its incumbent MP Frank Maguire. The 2 candidates for the seat were the Ulster Unionist Party's former leader, Harry West, and Bobby Sands, currently on hunger strike in H Block of the Maze Prison, and not representing any formal party but a loose coalition of Republican supporters on the ballot as anti-H Block/Armagh political prisoner, with the official Republican Party, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, standing down its candidate so as not to oppose him. Bobby Sands won the election by just over 1,400 votes, quite tight as these things go, and became the youngest man ever elected to Westminster at the age of 27, but obviously there was little prospect of him travelling to London to take up his seat at this stage, even if he'd wanted to. In response, the British government quickly drafted the Representation of the People Act, which would disqualify anyone in prison or on the run from prison for a term of over a year from being elected as an MP, and that became law in July. Things were not going well for Margaret Thatcher's government at all, because the day after the by-election in Northern Ireland, rioting began in the London borough of Brixton following a police anti-crime campaign that had started the previous week and was thought to disproportionately target the black community. When a young black man was arrested in Brixton, it triggered the worst race riots in British history, with petrol bombs, bricks and whatever else came to hand thrown at the police and their vehicles, with up to 5,000 rioters and injuries to 279 police and 45 members of the public, and over 100 vehicles burned out. And finally, the day after that, which was race day in Buenos Aires, the Space Shuttle Columbia took off on its maiden voyage, inaugurating the Space Shuttle program. During its 2-day test run, the thermostat, cargo doors, and, most importantly, the zero-G toilet all malfunctioned, but the mission was deemed a success. The program had been much delayed. The 1979 James Bond film Moonraker had been planned to release to coincide with the first test flights, and even in April 1981, a technical issue had forced the launch to be put back a week. By happy coincidence, it ended up being the 20th anniversary of the launch of Vostok 1, Yuri Gagarin's pioneering spaceflight. And so to Buenos Aires, where on the date of the Brazilian Grand Prix a new president had been sworn in. General Roberto Viola had taken over from General Jorge Videla, who had ousted Isabel Perón in the coup of 1976 and run the country as a military dictatorship ever since, citing the popularity of the 1978 Football World Cup in Argentina as evidence of the public's support for himself and the junta. So there was a slightly brittle atmosphere in the city as the public waited to see what the new regime would bring. There was a sombre mood in the paddock too. Some days earlier, motorbike and car racer Mike Halewood, Mike the Bike, had been killed along with his 9-year-old daughter in a road accident by a lorry making an illegal turn through the central reservation. Halewood entered 50 F1 Championship Grand Prix across 7 seasons, between 1963 and 65 and then again from 1971 to 74, and finished third at Le Mans in 1969, but was much better known and more successful on 2 wheels, winning 9 Motorbike World Championships and 14 Isle of Man TT races, most recently in 1978. An eccentric and cheerful presence, he was much missed, and his funeral was attended by Alain Prost, Nelson Piquet, Alan Jones, John Watson, René Arnoux, Gilles Villeneuve, Keke Rosberg, James Hunt, Niki Lauda and Carlos Reutemann, among others from the motorsport world. If locals were still uncertain about the new government, they were absolutely certain of one thing, that their hero Carlos Reutemann had been in the right 2 weeks earlier in Rio, and Alan Jones was persona non grata wherever he went, and even found himself being roughly handled by customs officers on his way into the country. The race at the Autodromo Municipal Ciudad de Buenos Aires would use the number 15 layout that had been in use since 1974, with its big loop around the lake, which would suit the more powerful cars, but it also had a twisty infield section which evened the odds a bit. One man who didn't make the trip to Argentina was Jean-Pierre Jarier, with his namesake Jabouille now more confident in his ankles after putting in some more testing laps, and Jarier, for his part, had made his displeasure about his treatment in Brazil known and been fired from the team. So, with Messrs Jabouille and Lafitte staying in South America between races, Guy Ligier himself strapped on a helmet to test a new double-spring suspension arrangement at the rather dilapidated Magny-Cours circuit in central France before coming out to Argentina with the new suspension. ATS boss Günther Schmidt, meanwhile, had always been a bit suspicious of the activities of his engineers in England, and from his base in Bad Dürkheim would regularly call them to check they were actually working, not loafing around, or alternatively, he suspected they were trying to undermine him. Between races, the engineers worked on getting Lammer's car back up to scratch and installed a new spoiler to see if it would improve performance. Attending a test day to check up on them, Schmidt was furious that they'd made an amendment without his say-so, pulled the offending item off the car, and jumped up and down on it. So all was going well there. There was a new, stiffer version of the March 811 to see if that was any less of an official piece of shit. Just one example that both drivers would take turns in, but much more attention was paid to the debut of McLaren's new car, the MP4. Again, just a single example, this time for the sole use of John Watson. John Barnard's revolutionary chassis had a monocoque made of carbon fibre, the first time the material had been used for a whole car like that, rather than as a strong but flexible material for things like wings. Some were unconvinced that the material was strong enough to withstand the forces of a crash at speed, while Colin Chapman, launching the Lotus 88 just a couple of days after McLaren announced the MP4, cheekily suggested that his concept was the future, and the MP4 was a bit out of date already. Ah yes, the Lotus 88. Still refusing to give up on the idea, Chapman had again brought it, and the Automobile Club of Argentina were supportive of it entering the race, but once again Bernie and the others were determined that it wouldn't. And in a rare display of unity, Jean-Marie Balestre was now also in the anti-Lotus camp, believing it violated the spirit of the new regulations, and so once again the car was ruled illegal by the stewards. Elio and Nigel would have to race the 81 again, and a very hacked-off Colin Chapman left Argentina before a wheel had even turned. he issued a strongly worded statement accusing both Fisa and Fokker of conspiring against him, and warning that if something wasn't done, F1 would descend into a cesspool of petty squabbles and infighting. He obviously hadn't been paying attention to the previous couple of years. Balestra fined Lotus $100,000 for the insult, at which point Fokker turned around and issued a statement criticising his authoritarianism. Lest anyone think Balestra was picking on the Lotus 88, however, he had declared that he wouldn't tolerate these constant attempts to build ground effect cars despite the regulations. The Argentine stewards were instructed to lay down a level surface at the pit lane entrance to measure the 6 cm ground clearance. When the teams went out for Friday qualifying then, Nelson Piquet with the Brabham's hydrodynamic suspension was quickest as he had been in Brazil, with Prost's turbo Renault proving trouble-free for once, second quickest just 3/10 behind. But the stewards declared the cars of Patrese, Pironi and De Angelis were not compliant with the ground clearance rules. Arrows, Ferrari and Lotus immediately appealed and showed that the stewards' equipment was completely inadequate and the cars were reinstated, so now it was their turn to have a go at Balestra. And with some estimates showing that Brabham's suspension had recovered 80% of the downforce lost through the skirt ban, compared to 50% for most others, Frank Williams and Jean Sage of Renault lodged a protest against the BT49C on Friday night, to the outrage, feigned or otherwise, of Gordon Murray, who pointed out that up until now Frank at least had been quite happy to accept the car as legal and only protested once it started beating the FW07. Over at Ligier, meanwhile, the new suspension hadn't worked at all. Jabouille was well off the pace anyway, and the end result was a blazing row between Guy Ligier and Gerard Ducarouge, and the former flying back to Paris on Saturday. So that made two team owners storming out, 14 to go. When the dust settled on Saturday's qualifying session, Piquet and Prost were still top of the pile, but a fired-up Jones had improved to third ahead of Reutemann. Arnoux was fifth in the other Renault, lining up alongside Hector Rebaque, who benefited from the clear superiority of the Brabham despite trialling a new Hewland gearbox. The Ferraris still couldn't do corners, and they were also having trouble with their engines. Villeneuve managed 7th alongside an excellent Rosberg, but Pironi was down in 12th. No qualifying heroics for Patrese this time, but still a very respectable 9th alongside De Angelis, with Watson putting the new MP4 11th on its debut, and it might have been higher if not for a faulty shock absorber. Mansell was 15th in the second Lotus, just ahead of Sura, who had to go carefully with only one engine available, and the Alphas were in trouble too, Andretti 17th and Giacomelli 22nd. De Cesaris in the old McLaren lined up 18th, and his countryman Storr 19th. Jacques Lafitte could only manage 21st in the ill-handling Ligier, Jan Lammers managed to qualify despite all the goings-on at ATS, and Riccardo Zannino took the last grid spot, meaning Guerra would miss his home race alongside his teammate Gabbiani, Jean-Pierre Jabouille and the two Marches. Daly improving in the new car to beat his teammate and Jean-Pierre, and came within a 10th of beating Gabbiani too, but still a long way off the actual grid. Race day was Reutemann's 39th birthday, and the fans were out in their droves to see their hero, many waving banners reading Reut Jones, and all keen to see Lola become the first Argentine to win his home Grand Prix since Fangio in 1957. The cars lined up, nice and neat at last, under sunny skies, and with a roar from the stands the lights went red, then green. From third on the grid, Jones got an absolute flyer to go between Piquet and Prost, the turbo lag on the Renault not helping a poor getaway for Alain, and the Australian then slingshotted around the outside of Piquet going into the first corner, while Eddie Cheever burned out his clutch and stuttered off the line, causing a bit of a blockage as everyone got round him. Piquet got a tow from Jones and then went back into the lead, while back in the pack Villeneuve slid at the curve round the end of the lake, and De Cesaris went off avoiding him, then made a complete bobbins of getting moving again, before finally getting underway, dead last except for Cheever, who once again limped round to retire at the end of lap 1, while Villeneuve hadn't fared much better, ending the lap 22nd, while Piquet led Jones, Reutemann, Patrese, Arnoux and Prost in the points positions, followed by Rebaque, a very fast starting Pironi, Rosberg and Watson making up the top 10. Piquet was clearly much faster than Jones, and immediately started putting some fresh air between himself and his pursuers, while further back on lap 2, Arnoux hit a bird on the way round the lake and damaged his front wing, losing places to Prost and Rebaque, but what the fans wanted was for Reutemann to be ahead of Jones at least, and they got their wish on lap 3 as he pulled out on the long back straight and took second to a deafening roar from the stands, but he was already 7 seconds behind Piquet. Prost with his turbo Renault and Rebaque with his hydrodynamic suspension both passed Patrese too, but the retirements were already piling up. Mansell and Pironi both came in at the end of that lap with engines in various states of self-disassembly, and Rosberg was in next time around with what turned out to be a terminal fuel system issue. As Piquet continued pulling away from Reutemann, the home hero was also pulling away from his teammate, who was having to hold off Prost and Rybacke, and soon the Renault was passed. A lap later, Rybacke followed suit, and as early as lap 6, Piquet set what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race. Having established a lead of some 12 seconds over Reutemann already, he eased off a bit to save tyres and engine, while still pulling away from Lole, who was driving the wheels off his Williams just to stay even vaguely in touch, and now had a charging Prost and Rybacke looming in his mirrors. Patrese, another driver without the advantage of turbo power or funky suspensions, was also dropping back, losing 6th to Arnoux and then 7th to a charging Watson. And with Andretti also charging, he probably wouldn't stay in 8th for long either. There was an interesting battle developing behind Reutemann between Prost and Rybacke. The Renault had the power advantage on the long straights, but the Brabham was much better in the infield, and for now they were concentrating on each other, leaving Carlos in second, relatively undisturbed. On lap 18, the Mexican bushwhacked the Frenchman at the hairpin at the entrance to the infield and took third, and quickly left Prost behind and gained on Reutemann. On lap 15, he was through without too much trouble, putting the Brabhams first and second with just over 20 seconds between them. Further back, a body panel had worked loose on Sierra's ensign, and his engine overheated and blew, ending his race and leaving his team hoping it was something fixable, while off-screen, Elio De Angelis was putting on a bit of a charge, having dropped right back to 20th after a third-lap contact with Sierra, and had now clawed his way back up to 11th. Piquet was lapping the rear of the field now, passing 17th place Jacques Lafitte, who was unhappy with the vibrations from his suspension. He finally decided it was unsafe to continue, and pulled in to retire after 19 laps, as Piquet sailed past his countryman Serra. You wouldn't know it from the TV coverage, but while Piquet was imperious in the lead, and Reutemann now a fairly safe third, 4 seconds behind Rybacke and 6 seconds ahead of Prost, there was a three-way battle going on between Jones, Arnoux and Watson as half-distance approached. Arnoux' damaged front wing was making his Renault handle even worse than usual in the corners, but he still had a big power advantage over the other two with their DFV V8s. Instead of watching that, the director focused on Piquet checking off the back markers, Giacomelli, Villeneuve, Zunino flying the flag for Tyrrell in their 150th race and heroically keeping the Ferrari behind him, no easy feat even if it wasn't a great car. A second lap on Lammers, who'd been in for repairs, then 12th placed Storr. Occasionally, for the sake of variety, we got to watch Reutemann, also circulating on his own and occasionally lapping someone. Eventually, though, the director noticed the actual motor racing happening, by which time the Jones-Arnoux-Watson trio had separated themselves out a bit. The best race of Rybacke's career to date came to an end on lap 33, a broken distributor arm putting paid to the Mexican's race, and to Brabham's hopes of a 1-2 finish, and the fans cheered as Reutemann inherited second, still nearly half a minute behind Piquet, but if one Brabham could break, why not both? Undoubtedly gutted, Rybacke still found time to give the crowd a wave, perhaps reflecting that he seemed to have a dominant car now and there was a lot of season yet to go. Off-camera, De Angelis passed his old team leader Andretti for 9th, while Watson felt something vibrating at the back of his car and came in. The team found nothing wrong and sent him back out, as De Angelis now disposed of Tombe, and before much longer both the Theodore and the McLaren MP4 were out, an oil leak in Tombe's case, and that vibration Watson felt turned out to be from a broken bearing, which wasn't fixable, but the new car had had a decent debut. Reutemann had a bit of a moment lapping Storr, who was going flat out with Villeneuve and Giacomelli behind him. Zunino had dropped behind all three of them after doing a bit of impromptu rallycrossing after a spin, and then on lap 42 he had one less driver to worry about as Villeneuve had a spectacular spin coming off the Salotto curve. He rejoined, scattering dirt all over the track, but the cause had been a broken driveshaft, and he went no further. There were by now just 10 laps to go, and aside from Patrese suffering throttle problems and losing 6th place to De Angelis, it didn't look like much would change in the top 6. Reutemann would have to make do with 2nd place to the utterly dominant Piquet, the crowd so disgruntled that apparently somebody chucked an orange at the Brabham a couple of laps from the end. It hadn't been a classic race, but Gordon Murray's point had been proved, and Nelson Piquet cruised home to take his 4th career win, lapping De Angelis on the penultimate lap, while the unfortunate Giacomelli, having just got past Storr, ran out of fuel and rolled to a stop on the last lap. Reutemann made the most of 2nd place, disappointed of course to be so far off Piquet's pace, but he was convincingly ahead of Jones, which meant he left Buenos Aires on top of the championship table, while Alain Prost was delighted with his first podium finish. Jones was 4th, Arnoux fifth to make it a double points finish for Renault to get them off the mark, and De Angelis took the final point as some consolation for Lotus after yet another frustrating weekend. Patrese took 7th, Mario Andretti was 8th, and Siegfried Storr took his first finish in 9th, with Giacomelli classified 10th, and De Cesaris, Lammers and Zanino the remaining runners at the end, the Tyrrell driver making the best of his 2 races with 2 finishes, both 13th and last, 2 laps down in this case after being penalised a lap for taking that shortcut after his spin. The dominance of the BT49C didn't do anything to dampen the politics after the race. With no disrespect to Hector Abaque, the sight of him breezing past defending champion Jones and home hero Reutemann only served to underline the difference in the cars. Jean Sage of Renault lodged another protest against the car, which was rejected on the grounds that the car was indeed 6 centimetres clear of the ground when they measured it, as the rules stipulated. There was now a 3-week gap before the start of the European season, with the inaugural San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, an interval that would be one of feverish activity by all the teams, especially the Tolman team, who would be making their debut there, having missed the expensive flyaway races to prepare. Despite being a small independent British team, their turbo engines aligned them more with the Fisa side than the Fokker, and the likes of Renault and Ferrari would be maybe hoping for another voice critical of the controversial Brabham suspension. It certainly seemed like whatever the Concord Agreement had achieved, it hadn't taken the politics out of Formula One.